Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And Randy, thank you so very much for giving me the opportunity to follow 7 weeks of amazing content brought to all of us by some of the most incredible, some of the most thoughtful, some of the most inspiring, some of the most resilient, some of the most baddest, dopest women in our industry. So thank you, Randy, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for being a friend. And thank you so much for pivoting Fab. I was so looking forward to coming down to Charleston, but I'm so glad that you had the ability to pivot and still make space, right, for us to come together. So thank you so very much. And thank to all of the panelists who contributed to the conversation and to the content. I did not have the opportunity to listen to all of the panels, but surely I tuned in to many of them, and I learned something every single time I tuned in. So thank you, ladies, so very much. Trying times right now. And so I'm just going to speak a little bit about what I'm paying attention to, what I'm studying, what I'm reading, what's giving me hope, what's giving me inspiration during these times, and what's giving me the fire so that we can create change. So during these times, times of great social and political upheaval, I find myself trawling through history for inspiration. I'm an avid reader, and I find myself going back to and reading historical content, not only for inspiration, but more importantly, for understanding. Because I'm in search. I'm in search of greater content to this continuous cycle of oppression and protest and uprising in America. And history is often an act of creating frames or unifying themes. Some things that I'm paying attention to. So this August, the nation celebrated its 100th year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. It was at this time that the very first White House protest took place, where the suffragists, who amid a world war, and guess what, a flu pandemic, unfurled banners and demanding of President Woodrow Wilson, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? But that's not the complete story. The struggle for suffrage did not end with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because history tells us that Black women, Indigenous women, women of color were denied access to the polls for decades after the amendment was passed. And history tells us, even at this present day, the struggle continues as many Americans still face barriers to the voting booth. History can inform and give us context to what is happening today, because the movements that we are witnessing now are the direct descendants of the movements of the past. So what are we learning from history? With the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing civil unrest, historians and educators and the general public, they're once again fixated on a point in history that we call the long, hot summers of the 1960s, when African American cities all over the country protested and rioted over what, you ask? Police abuse and segregation. With every year for the latter half of that decade, parts of American cities were in flames, embroiled in widespread protest. As for myself, I'm looking outside of the uprisings of the long, hot summers of the 1960s. I'm looking at Queens in 1973. I'm looking at Miami in 1980, Los Angeles in 1992, Cincinnati in 2001, Ferguson in 2014, Minneapolis, Portland, Kenosha in 2020. It continues. Because when you study history, it's important and it's impossible to ignore that the kindlings for the fire this time collects year after year over the decades. You know, I've become obsessed with fire. My friend and my mentor, Martha Hoover, who I love dearly, just recently sent me this re-release book. Thank you so much, Martha. I love it. I've been digging into it, but Martha just sent me this re-release book that is called The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin and Steve Shapiro. And in his classic essay collection, James Baldwin evoked the biblical story of Noah and his ark, asserting that if America could not right its wickedness, it would surely be destroyed by fire. The quote is, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire, next time. I'm also reading the book of poems by Eve Ewing. This book here, 1919, is a book of poem that channels her city's hot red summer. It's a magical work, and the centerpiece of this bracing work is a story that's called The True Stories About the Great Fire, where the prose illustrates how white people view the migration of Black people from the north, from the south to the north, as a form of destruction on par with the Great Chicago Fire of 1919. And listen, I'm not the only person who's thinking about fire. If you got the latest issue of Vanity Fair magazine, the September issue with Breonna Taylor on the cover, Ta-Nehisi Coates summarizes the racialized climate of this country in his new piece, which is amazing. That's called The Great Fire. This notion of fire is on the minds of not only myself, but I know the minds of many, because often we prefer to hear the triumphs rather than face the tragedies. But an honest account of who we've been can enable us to see who we should be, who we should be. And that's why I'm also rereading a really favorite book of mine, speaking from a preacher's kid, which is called The Black Prophetic Fire by Dr. Cornel West. Here, Dr. West examines the lives of W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker, and how the courage that they had to speak prophetic fire shows up in calling attention to the inequality that's lacking in our leaders today. Dr. West uses this term, Black prophetic fire. And he describes two types of revolutionaries. One, of course, is Dr. King, this charismatic leader who serves as the face of the movement. And the other is a movement organizer by the name of Ella Baker, who worked tirelessly for the cause rather than a specific movement. And so my work at FoodLab Detroit and my leadership style comes out of this long tradition of Black prophetic fire. And what that simply means is that when you have a leadership style that echoes Black prophetic fire, it engages in frank speech, plain speak, Socratic questioning. You can't talk about fire alone without talking about prophetic fire. And if you talk about prophetic fire, you have to wrestle with the question of what does it mean to be human? And so my question to folks that I'm asking today, this morning, is what does it mean for you to be human during this time? Because before we can talk about the work of food system transformation, before we can talk about rebuilding the restaurant industry, the question is, and it's an existential one, the question is what kind of human being are you going to choose to be? What kind of virtues, what kind of visions are you going to enact? How are your visions going to be embodied through your work in this industry? And these questions put at the very center any talk about leadership. And when you talk about leadership in the sense of, within the context of prophetic fire, you have to talk about justice. And if you talk about justice, then you have to tackle and talk about and wrestle with forms of death. And that's the problem. Because the problem with America is that it's easy to talk about America. And it's easy to talk about America without hardly ever talking about the indigenous people who were here before us. And that's because in this country, we have a problem with death. We are a death-dodging, death-ducking, death-denying empire. We don't like to be reminded of death in this country. But if you're going to speak prophetically, you have to come to terms with death. If we're going to talk about the rebuilding of this industry, we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that this industry is dying. And what does that mean when we want to entangle ourselves with death? Because in order to live, you must learn how to die. Because every time you examine a judgment or a presupposition, anytime you are examining a prejudice that you have and you're willing to give that up, anytime you are saying that this is not right, I was wrong, this industry is wrong, I'm willing to give this up for something better, that is a form of death. There is no maturation, there is no development, there is no growth without death. And so we have to engage with death as a critical process, but it has some structural challenges. When you engage with death as a critical process, it has some structural challenges. And that's why prophetic fire is so crucial, it's so important. And that's why when you hear people say, listen to Black women, follow Black women, invest in Black women, if you engage in death as a critical process, Black women, Black people have the ability to navigate those structural challenges. Because it's important that you realize, because is it impossible in America, 400 years, to be a Black person and not be on some intimate form of death? I'll give you some examples. Death, social death. Black people have had to wrestle with that. Slavery, 244 years, no social status, just a commodity to be bought and sold. Social death. Civil death. Here comes Jim Crow, 90 years of civic death, part of a society body, but no civil rights that allow you to be a part of public life. American lynching, terrorism, every 2.5 days, some Black woman, man, or child hanging from a tree, strange fruit. Civic death, psychic death. Told you have the wrong hips, the wrong lips, the wrong hair color, the wrong skin color. Death. Spiritual death, feeling as though your hope is a joke, your history is a curse, that your sense of freedom is a pipe dream. That's death. So it is important, if we're going to talk about the death of an industry, that we listen to, that we center people who have an intimate relationship with death and who can connect the social and the spiritual, the economic and the existential, the personal and the politics, and still have the ability to link it to something bigger than their individual selves. If transformation is going to be at all possible in this industry, we have to link it to something bigger than our individual selves and our individual businesses. And the best of prophetic tradition that I come out of, this Black prophetic tradition, is the ability to engage in frank speech and plain speech. And so that's why I have such deep appreciation, such love for a dear friend and a dear brother of mine, a writer, a cook, an entrepreneur, an artist. His name is Tunde Way. And in late March, Tunde, not long after the coronavirus brought our industry to a halt, Tunde used Instagram to post an essay that was entitled, "Don't Bail Out the Restaurant Industry." He starts with, we're on the cusp of something ordinary. And he continues to say, we're on the cusp of everything remaining the same. He has spent his life while in America working in and commenting on and questioning in a very Socratic way the restaurant industry. In his essay, he says, an industry where labor is segregated by race and gender, underpaid and uninsured, an industry fed largely by a hyper-commercial agricultural system that either enacts profits from the environment with little consequences or offers ethical source produce to just a few for a lot. Let it die. an industry where on the higher end is great food at fat prices and spaces that drive up real estate value, pushing property prices higher and poorer people further. And on the lower scale, working poor people are barely making enough to keep them going. They're serving low nutritious meals to other working poor people who can't afford quality housing because of predatory development that supports new restaurants. Let it die. All over the spectrum, a white man gets paid off of all of that. Let it die. There is no maturation. There is no development. There is no growth without death. My question is, who's ready to engage with death as a critical process in the transformation of the restaurant industry? So again, I come from this tradition of a Black prophetic fire. Frederick Douglass, Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King, whose comments, much like Tunde's, scared the mainstream. But it follows this Socratic questioning on what it means to be human. Now, the type of prophetic fire that I'm seeing today, even in our industry right this minute, and I'm being inspired by and motivated by, is the form of prophetic fire in the leadership of movement organizers like Ella Baker, who works tirelessly for a cause rather than a specific movement. She was the type of leader who didn't lead by calling herself a leader. She led by raising questions and loving others in such a way that they exemplified what people want to see in their leaders. What does it mean to understand that you are a part of an industry that is leaderful, and that it's not all about you? It's not only about a couple of people being lifted up and raised up as the gods of an industry. We are a leaderful industry. There's not one, there's not two, there's not three. All of us are leaders in our own right. See, it's these kinds of leaders who are generative, who understood that resilience of this industry, if it is going to sustain, if it is going to survive, leadership comes from decentralization. No one person in this industry holds the power. No one person should be uplifted as the savior. And the movement that showed us that best has to be Ferguson. Ferguson showed us the power of individuals willing to act without a single leader. Their leaderful example gave us and continues to give me inspiration to stand up in real time, offline and online, to change legislation and also perceptions. We are a leaderful industry, and it is up to all of us as leaders to be a part of the change. Another thing that I'm paying attention to when I think about how Ella Baker was a leader in the context of this Black prophetic fire is that the movements that I'm seeing right now are fractal. What that means that they are practicing at small scale, where most of us want small scale practices on what most of us want to see on a universal level. Small scale. I can't reiterate that enough, because there will be no more growth in this industry without experiments. We have to experiment. We have to iterate. We have to be able to pivot. And I'm seeing that all across the country with chefs and cooks who are doing this fractal work. And what that means, you see when men and women, especially men and women of color, practicing small pop-ups, dining spaces, pop-ups. Restaurateurs are kind of popping up, grocery stores and markets in their restaurant, pop-ups, to sustain themselves and their radical creativity. Fractal work, small scale experimentation. And another trend that I'm paying attention to is that rather than narrowing into one path, leaders are creating more and more possibilities. And that's what I want. That's what I want to see. There is not going to be one perfect path that takes us forward. There's not going to be just one way. There's going to be an abundance of different methodologies. There's going to be an abundance of different ways that are going to move our industry forward. As long as we learn how to manage the resources together and be brilliant together, we will get through this time. And so what I know for sure is this, is the pandemic has strengthened this idea of restaurants as community. The risk of losing your favorite coffee shop where you read your Sunday paper. The risk of losing your favorite hangout spot where your friends and your families come together. The risk of losing your favorite restaurant where you celebrate those milestone moments in your life has galvanized people within the restaurant industry to think through what a better future looks like. And those outside of it, they've now started to pay attention to and care about the people working at the restaurants as much as they care about the restaurants themselves. And once that behavioral shift, once that mentality shift starts to happen and you start to be attuned and aware of the significance of restaurants, it becomes a part of the fabric of the culture. And at the heart of it all, this is why it's so important for me. And that's why it's so important for so many people who I love to ensure that the independent restaurants, the mom and pop restaurants, particularly in Black and brown communities, survive because they are the fabric of the culture of our neighborhoods. And I don't want to wake up in a world where we are empty of culture, because restaurants play such a significant role in feeding and nurturing the spirit and also practicing this prophetic fire. You have to have restaurants during this time to sustain your soul. And if we don't have the tradition of Willie Mae Sutton, if we don't have the tradition of Edna Lewis, if we don't have the tradition of Leah Chase and Mildred Mama Dip Council and Georgia Gilmore, Charlotte Jenkins, and Doelster Miles, women, Black women, who believed in the feeding and sustaining of a soul, not just the stimulating of your senses on a plate, but they believed in the care and the nurturing of others. Women who weren't bound by convincing you to consume, but they didn't believe in just putting the attention on themselves, but they wanted to give you the gift that allowed you to feel loved. That is what is going to sustain us. That is so important as a component of a restaurant. You know, I think about, when I think about these women, and I think about the feeding of a soul, I think about the 1977 poet, an essay that was written by a Black feminist writer. Her name is Audre Lorde. And she wrote this poem, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And she talks about how poetry doesn't just reflect the world as it exists, it ushers in a new one. It forms the quality, the light from which we predicate our hopes and our dreams. It leads us towards survival and change. First made into language, then an idea, and then a more tangible action. She said, there are no new ideas. There are only new ways of making them felt. How are you making people feel? That has been resonating with me when I think about restaurants in the future. How are you making people feel when they visit your establishment? And in Poetry is Not a New Luxury, Audre Lorde writes, the white father told us, I think, therefore I am. But the Black mother within each of us whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. How are we making people feel? Because after all, the word restaurant in its core meaning comes from restore. How are we restoring souls in our places of business? Because I do believe that's important. Because what I'm paying attention to as I study history, as I'm being mindful of the things that are happening right now, is I believe that we are at a moment. We are at a moment in history where we are entering the era of citizenship. We are entering the era of citizen, a time when people are dissatisfied with being just mere consumers, but they're yearning for agency. They're yearning for control over what really matters to them. They're yearning for an authentic participation based on purpose. We're yearning for a brighter future. And now with this COVID-19 pandemic and with civil unrest, we're at a historical moment. And this historical moment is going to allow us to create a couple of frameworks. And I heard some of them throughout the 7 weeks of the FAB conference. This particular time was a lens to make sense of what's really happening. It's a way to frame this deeper choice that we have when we are talking about how we enter into this new era as a collective. But this moment is also an invitation for us to step into our agency, to shape the future. We are living now. Here's the warning. We are living in a contest between two deep stories. They're present and alive right now at this moment. And one will emerge as the dominant story if we aren't paying attention. So there is the consumer story, and there is what I call the citizen story. The consumer story could also be restored, and y'all know what I'm talking about. That's the people who want things to go back to normal, right? It's like the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. Some of us want that very badly. That means we want our commutes, we want our coffee, we want our crises put back where we can open again. Let's just open back up. And let's pick up where we left off. And there are powerful interests and a whole lot of money putting into right now making that happen. Going back to normal. What does that even mean? Picking up where we left off. But there's a huge story. There's a huge opportunity. And that huge opportunity is that we could choose to step forward into what I call the citizen story. And I think that we're already seeing myriad ways that people and communities and organizations are reclaiming agency and finding purpose. I see it in the equitable models that I'm observing right now that's happening in our industry. Those actions are already in progress. This citizen story. I see it in the unionization push, where workers in restaurants and grocery stores are looking to unionize. They're advocating for better working conditions. That's a citizen story. I see it with restaurants who are willing to continue to do the hard work and do away with tipping. That's a citizen story. I see it when restaurants and chefs and cooks are incorporating mutual aid into their business model. Mutual aid groups and hyper-local self-organizing units, they're starting to spring up everywhere across the country. That's a citizen story. Business and suppliers and farmers are coming together. That's a citizen story. There's a part of us that is deeper and more fundamental and has been more starved that is nourished by this. And this too could grow. This does not have to be just a nice side effect of this virus. It doesn't have to be just a nice side effect because we see civil unrest happening all across the country, y'all. This could be the beginning of a new story. But the bigger truth is that no government can make the citizen story happen without us, for us. It will require communities across the country and across the world and organizations from across the sector to lead into new ways of thinking and operating. And it will require that this be driven by individuals who have the courage to think differently, act differently, practice Socratic questioning, speak clearly, speak frankly, or as the young people say, speak truth to power. And I think that this is happening now. Careers, reputation, legacies are going to be made in the coming months. Many of them, I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing it. Organizations of all sectors are starting to reorientate themselves dramatically. This is what it means for society to reshape. And it's a huge moment of opportunity for us all, individually and collectively. And so I want to hearken back to the words of Audre Lorde, because I think we are in a great position to sort of reevaluate and reimagine restaurants as a place where success doesn't have to just mean profit, but where it can also mean community. I'm reading Audre Lorde, I'm reading Eve Ewing, I'm reading James Baldwin, I'm reading poetry because poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary demand that we can reimagine. It lets me know that the possibility of freedom, it is possible. And our dreams can point the way to freedom. And those dreams are made more realizable through poems that give us strength and courage to see and to feel and to speak and to dare. And one of the things that I love about Audre Lorde is she recognized the power of the self within her creative work as a way forward for political and social transformation. And that for real change to happen, that has to be not just dreaming, y'all, but we have to put our dreams into action. In her writings and in her poetry, Audre Lorde urges us to speak out and to bear witness. And so the question I have for us today is, what are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you are sickened and you die? Will you remain silent? Will you continue to hold those in your belly, in your gut, or will you speak out? Because we can overcome the fear of the challenges that we face today with imagination and hope. Hope not as a wish for things to be different, but a deep desire for change rooted in the belief of human potential. The deep desire and change for solidarity and mutual generosity. The cynicism of the status quo is not new. It was a belief that American slavery couldn't be ended. It was a belief that Jim Crow would never fail. It was a sneer at the idea that women will never have the right to vote. But all of that was made possible. And I can hear it today, people calling out for change, and I believe that change is possible. But no social movement begins with the question of what is possible. It's typically fueled by imagining what could be. This will be the challenge of the new movement that emerges in our industry. The challenge that vast inequalities of the COVID-19 has exposed. And my question to us all is, what are we imagining? What are we dreaming? What are we speaking? What are we seeing? What are we saying? And what kind of leadership style are we bringing to the table to ensure that our dreams are actually executed and the possibility of a new industry is actually made into reality? Randy, thank you again so much for allowing me to give these closing remarks. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for attending the FAB conference. It has been my honor. It has been my privilege to be a part of this amazing, amazing conference. Thank you.